Good. Welcome everybody. Welcome people from maybe from Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland, and also maybe in Australia. Yeah. And welcome all the attendees and participants to this public lecture organized by the Center for Catholic Studies at Chinese University of Hong Kong. Our public talks, our public lecture covers different areas of studies, sometimes on the theology or, ethics and the church history. And today we'll focus on draw your attention to the history in the mainland China or the China church. And I think when we talk about the history of the China church, we always maybe have an idea or an image of a missionary, the Matteo Ricci. And Matteo Ricci is an Italian, right? Italian missionary. And so it's very interesting that, how did Matteo Ricci translate the Christianity text, into Chinese, or, how can Matteo Ricci translate Chinese classics into Latin so the European Christians can understand the Chinese classics. So today we are so happy to have our honorable speaker and respondent, and in particular our moderator, Father Patrick. And it's quite international, and I say, Dr. Daniel Canaris from Australia, and Father Thierry Menard, native from France, but he's still teaching in Guangzhou. And so we are so happy to have these distinguished scholars and moderators to organize this talk. And I just, give mic to Father Patrick, and he's the moderator of today. And Father.
Okay, thank you so much for your nice introduction. So as a moderator, usually, I have the duty to introduce the topic, and also the speaker, and also in this case, also the respondent. So first of all, the topic. As you have noticed, we have a very interesting and intriguing topic related to the encounter between missionaries and China. And it's about saints and sages mediating Christian and Chinese concepts of human excellence in the late Ming Dynasty in the 1580s. As you all know, when the Jesuit missionaries Michele Ruggieri, an Italian, and also Matteo Ricci, established the first Jesuit mission in China, the terms translatability and cultural incommensurability were yet to enter the European lexicon. But these questions were addressed implicitly through the translation choices employed in these questions by the missionaries. So for the early missionaries, translatability had immense ramifications for their missionary practice. And one of the foremost challenges was how to communicate in Chinese the concept of sanctity, which was central to Christian soteriology. There was a range of terms in Chinese intellectual and religious traditions that the Jesuits drew upon to translate Sanctus, such as shengren, zhenren, and xian. Had each of these terms implied a certain commensurability between Christian and indigenous Chinese conceptions of human excellence. So we are very happy and also very honored to have Dr. Daniel Canaris here among us, and he will present a microhistory of early Jesuit attempts to translate Sanctus in Chinese and reflect upon the significance of these translation choices for the development of the Jesuits' missionary strategy. So let me then briefly introduce, a privilege to me personally, but I'm confident in the future we will. So Dr. Daniel is currently a DECRA, and for those who are not familiar with this acronym, it means Discovery Early Career Researcher Award in Australia. And he's a research fellow in the School of Languages and Cultures of the University of Sydney. Prior to the present appointment, he was associate professor at Nanjing University and postdoctoral researcher at Sun Yat-sen University. His research focuses on the Sino-Western intellectual exchange in the early modern period and the Italian Enlightenment, especially the thought of Giambattista Vico, and I'm happy to hear this name. I encountered him in the past several times, this person. Dr. Daniel's first monograph was on Vico and China and was published in the Oxford University's Studies of the Enlightenment series. That and subsequent book publications include a translation and critical edition of Longo Mardo's, another Jesuit, a brief response in the controversies over Shangdi, Tianshan, and Linghun. This was published in the Palgrave Studies. So I don't want to go into more detail. Dr. Daniel, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Father Patrick Cavane, for your warm introduction, and also Professor Lam for your kind invitation to visit the Center for Catholic Studies this past month. It's been an honor for me to present some of my recent research as part of your lecture series. I'm also grateful to Father Thierry Menard for putting me in contact with Professor Lam, and also for your availability to give feedback on my presentation. So as you can see here on the PowerPoints, I hope it's clear to everybody, the talk that I'm giving today is entitled Saints and Sages, Mediating Christian and Chinese Concepts of Human Excellence in the Late Ming Dynasty. Perhaps I should probably alter that title a little bit because I also deal with the early Qing Dynasty as well. So what I'm interested in exploring here is how the first Jesuit missionaries who arrived in China from the early 1580s onwards came to express the idea of Christian sainthood to their Chinese audiences, and then also how they understood the commensurability between Chinese and Christian conceptions of human excellence. So for the Jesuit missionaries, sanctity was one of the most important yet challenging concepts that they needed to convey in Chinese. After all, the very raison d'etre of Christianity was that salvation from the horrors of hell and the enjoyment of eternal life in heaven were contingent upon conversion to Christianity through baptism. In Latin Christianity, a person who achieves this state of salvation is designated Sanctus, translating the Greek hagios. The translation of Sanctus was further complicated by its polyvalence, or the fact that it has many different meanings operating at the same time in a different context. So among other things, it could be used as a honorific, for individuals with specific religious functions, such as the Holy Father, reference to a term of address for the Pope. And also it can indicate in more general terms, something sacred, or set aside for religious use, such as holy water. But, when we address the Pope as Holy Father, we're not implying in any way that the Pope is saved or, one of the elect. Now, in the Chinese language, there's a wealth of vocabulary to express this concept of Sanctus. And, it goes beyond the purview of my talk and perhaps even my expertise to go through all these different translation choices. And so in this talk, I'm just going to highlight, a few words which were used in some of these early Jesuit texts and translations. And so most importantly, within the Confucian tradition, we have, of course, the term shengren, indicating a figure of exemplary virtue. This was a very ancient term, appearing already in the Book of Changes. This term also appears in Taoist texts as well. But the Taoist tradition also had its own lexicon for sanctity, terms like xian, which in English we conventionally translate as immortal, or zhenren, which is a very difficult word to translate into English, which I guess you could translate as realized person. Now, as each of these terms were ancient in provenance, the choice of term had significant implications for how the Jesuit missionaries portrayed the relationship between Christianity and China's own religious and philosophic traditions. Now, in recent years, there have been some really interesting comparative studies on Christian and Confucian concepts of moral excellence. So one study which I've encountered recently is by the Taiwanese historian Huang Jinxing, who takes the comparability of these respective traditions to challenge the prevailing view that Confucianism was purely secular in outlook. For Huang, the institutional process sages and the correlates, the so-called surrounding their cult, resemble Catholic canonization and the Catholic devotion towards the saints. And so on this basis, Huang argues that Confucianism is fundamentally religious in nature. Now, by way of contrast, another scholar by the name of An Tran follows perhaps the more common and conventional view of Confucianism as primarily a moral philosophy. And so for Tran, shengren is more of a moral or anthropological ideal. And so Tran de-emphasizes devotions towards shengren and Confucianism and argues instead that in contrast with Christianity, the Confucian sage was more focused on human fulfillment in the present life. And so Tran proposes this Confucian idea of the sheng as something which can enrich Christianity, particularly Asian Christianity, correcting as what Tran sees as an excessive focus on sin and suffering that can be found in some aspects of the Christian tradition. Now, I've highlighted the work of these two scholars for a few reasons. First, I think this scholarship shows just how enriching and useful comparative approaches can be, for fine-tuning how we understand and how we categorize ideas and traditions of thought. Two, both these scholars place their understanding of the Confucian shengren in relation to their overall interpretation of Confucianism. So Huang, who sees Confucianism as a religion, naturally stresses the devotional aspects of shengren, whereas Tran, who sees Confucianism as primarily a moral philosophy, focuses on shengren as a moral exemplar. And what I find really interesting about these studies is, despite these, being scholarship, being published now effectively in the past decade, both these positions have antecedents in early modern missionary debates about the Chinese rites. So Tran, for instance, is heir to the Jesuit reading pioneered by Matteo Ricci. Now, we might say cynically that Tran follows the Jesuit view because he happens to be a Jesuit. But in fact, the Jesuit position has been so influential that even today in the PRC, Confucianism is not recognized as a religion. Huang's focus on ritual and devotional practices resembles the position of Dominican and Franciscan friars who criticize the Confucian ancestral rituals as superstitious and idolatrous. The third point that I want to stress here is that in contrasting Christian and Chinese conceptions of moral excellence, there is a presumption that the natural point of contact for Christianity in this dialogue with Chinese thought should be Confucianism. But this comparison is a reflection of a contingent choice made by Matteo Ricci to seek an accommodation between Confucianism and Christianity, which took place 15 years or almost 15 years after the mission started. And so with this Confucian orientation, it is only natural that Ricci would translate the Christian Sanctus as the Confucian shengren. But as I'd like to explore in this talk, in the first 15 years of the mission, the Jesuits used Taoist vocabulary to express Christian notions of sanctity. The question that we need to ask here is whether we should broaden comparative analysis. Now, historians of the China mission have not devoted that much attention to the development of the Jesuits' translation strategies for Christian sanctity. And I think that this is in part because the translatability of Sanctus was not, at least explicitly, a central focus of the Chinese rites controversy. Because the Chinese rites controversy, of course, concerned primarily the permissibility of rituals in honors of ancestors, what we call the Jesuit rituals, or of Confucius, the Qigong. But just as defining shengren was important for Huang and Tran's respective accounts of Confucianism as a whole, so it also provided important philological evidence for the missionaries when they were debating the meaning of rituals during the Chinese rites controversy. So these are the objectives of my talk. So in the first part of my talk today, I'd like to show, first of all, that the Jesuits' initial attempts to translate Christian sanctity into Chinese drew upon non-Confucian vocabulary, in particular Taoism. I believe the Jesuits benefited from the fact that they were far away from Rome, and there were few other than themselves who had the linguistic and cultural knowledge to understand the significance of their translation choices. And so, without competition on the mission field, they could develop an elastic and experimental approach, which goes against the grain of a homogenizing Tridentine Catholicism. And so it's in this liminal and hybrid space, their translation choices tracked and even had a bearing on their identity as they came to be seen by their Chinese interlocutors as Taoist sages. So Ricci's famed decision to don the robes of a Confucian literatus also occasioned a radical shift in the Jesuits' vocabulary for sainthood and their identity among the Chinese. Yet these translation choices also caused significant confusion among their Chinese interlocutors, about what is the nature of Christianity and who are these missionaries coming to preach this strange doctrine to us. And so I believe that these translation choices also, in a way, exemplify the difficulties that are inherent to intercultural communication. And so it is my hope that, that these historical insights into the Jesuits' first translation attempts can help comparative analysis of the Christian and Chinese context move beyond this focus on Confucianism and be informed by a richer analysis of China's religious and intellectual diversity. Now, in the second half of my talk, I will reflect on some of the theological ramifications of the Jesuits' lexical choices for expressing Christian sanctity. And so I'm moving more onto the European context, the debates that took place in Europe in the 17th century. So in using shengren, Richie implied a certain commensurability between a Christian saint and a Confucian sage, which in turn opened the question as to what extent salvation was extended to virtuous pagans. These arguments are developed primarily in the missionaries' Western language writings. And I argue that despite later Jesuits presenting Confucian rites as civil and political, Ritchie consciously employs the technical vocabulary and the distinctions of Christian sainthood to legitimize the practiced in Confucius's honor. The Jesuits' monopoly over the Chinese mission field ended with the arrival of Franciscan and Dominican friars in the 1630s. And these friars famously instigated the Chinese rites controversy when they challenged the Jesuits' toleration of Confucian and ancestral rituals among Chinese Catholic converts. In my analysis of these texts, I will focus on the divergent views of the Jesuits and Dominican friars over whether shengren was a religious category and the salvation of Confucius, and discuss the significance of these points for the development of the Chinese rites controversy. Now, from the beginning of the 1580s, when the Jesuits first entered mainland China, they attempted to implement a policy of accommodation that had been famously pioneered by Alessandro Valignano, who held the office of visitor, which was the which had the responsibility, for overseeing the mission on behalf of the superior general of the Jesuits. So Valignano's aim was to make Christianity more relatable to the Chinese by drawing upon China's indigenous and cultural and intellectual traditions, and in this way facilitate conversion. But at first, this policy did not specify explicitly which tradition to draw upon, and the Jesuits were quite eclectic in their approach. The Jesuits styled themselves as Buddhist monks, and they also borrowed significant vocabulary from Buddhism, but from very early on, they also studied the Confucian classics. Now, the first Jesuit publication in China was the Tianru Shilu, the True Record of the Lord of Heaven. This work was published in 1584, and is thus, one of, or perhaps the, first Chinese language publication ever authored by a European. The engagement with Confucianism in this work is primarily limited to moral precepts, such as comparisons between Christian and Confucian filial piety. For spiritual vocabulary, however, Buddhism and Taoism were privileged. So one might even argue that this eclecticism that we see in this work mirrors in a certain way the contemporary Chinese approaches in the late Ming, especially with the doctrine of the Sanjiaohe, the unity of the three teachings. Now, Ruggieri's language for expressing the concept of Christian sanctity here is overtly Taoist. And so now let's have a look at some of the expressions that Ruggieri uses. So let's start with the expressions that Ruggieri uses for saints in heaven. So we see here, the first one here is "de dao shen xian," which we could translate literally as immortals who have obtained the way. The second being "de dao zhenren," which we could translate as true man who has attained the way, or realized man who has attained the way. Now, there's it's not clear if there's any distinction in meaning between these two terms. If we look at the original source text of the Latin, which Ruggieri used in rendering this work into Chinese, it's just really referring to the same thing, Sanctus. Now, in Taoism, the Tao has a specialized meaning of realizing the Tao, and in the Zuowang meditative practice, it indicates the final stage where the adept is liberated with full knowledge of the Tao and has transcended all worldly limitations. Shen xian or xian indicates the divine immortal, or the transcendent beings who have attained longevity or immortality, other extraordinary powers, such as bilocation, invincibility, and therapeutic abilities as well. Now, when it comes to the difference between zhenren and xian, I'm no expert on Taoism, but my understanding is that there's a little bit of crossover between these terms, and in fact, the distinctions aren't always clear in Taoist texts. But apparently, zhenren indicates a higher degree of perfection in some Taoist texts. And so I've got this passage here from the Zhuangzi, which basically defines the zhenren, as someone who's achieved this state of supreme indifference and is impervious to all human vicissitudes, seeing success and failure as human constructions that are foreign to the Tao. So you can read that at your own leisure. What about some other vocabulary that Ruggieri uses to indicate saints in the Christian tradition? I find very interesting how Ruggieri refers to Moses. He actually has 3 different expressions I could see for Moses, again, with no apparent distinction in meaning. In the first instance, we have 得到知识, and we also have 得到知人, and then for third term, we have 道士, which of course is the technical term for an ordained Taoist priest. And to me, it's unclear, why does Ruggieri alter his vocabulary? And I think even to the lay Chinese reader who hasn't got knowledge of the biblical text to which Ruggieri is referring, it's unclear that Ruggieri is referring to the same person. For the Virgin Mary, Ruggieri uses 道女, which apparently was a term used to indicate a female Taoist priest. Interestingly, when referring to Saint Augustine, Ruggieri opts for this term, xian shi, which I guess we could translate in English as a talented scholar. As far as I can see, this term does not really seem to be aligned to any particular tradition. And also, I think it doesn't really quite capture Augustine's status as a saint in the Christian tradition. It's just focuses more on Augustine's intellectual qualities, as opposed to this notion of moral excellence to a supreme degree. We also see the character sheng on a couple of occasions in the Tiandu Shilu. But interestingly, this character sheng never appears with personal names. So it appears as a qualifier with jiao to form sheng jiao, and that's the term that Ruggieri uses to convey this notion of Christianity as a religion. And it also appears with shui to mean holy water. It's also instructive to look at some of the other texts that we have, which date to the mid, at least to the mid 1580s. And one of these texts is the Portuguese Chinese dictionary that Ricci and Ruggieri collaborated on. And we can see here the dictionary entry for the word santo is xian. And so we're going to see also in some other texts that basically xian appears as the default translation for santo for the missionaries at the time. I find also Ruggieri's translation of the angelic salutation of the Ave Maria to be quite interesting, because at the beginning of his prayer, Mary is addressed as Xian Maria. This is quite superfluous because, as we know at the beginning of this prayer, we don't address Our Lady as Holy Mary at the beginning. We just address her as Hail Mary. It's a salutation, right? And so perhaps it's a little bit of overkill here on Ruggieri's part, or perhaps it's also attributable to Ruggieri's Chinese collaborator who would have perhaps helped him in the translation of the prayer. He probably didn't understand this meaning of Ave. But you can also notice that in the second half of the prayer, Holy Mother is rendered as Sheng Mu Niang Niang. Okay. Now this doesn't break the rule that I just said that Sheng doesn't appear with personal names, because of course Mu is not a personal name. Another important source we have is Richies World Map, upon which this concept of Sanctus appears in relation to toponyms, the names of places where the word saint appears. And so I've highlighted some examples on the map here. So For San Lorenzo, we have Xian Lao Leng Zu Dao. That's referring to Madagascar. For Sao Tome, Xian Duo Mo Dao. But interestingly, the Holy Land is again rendered as Sheng Tu. Okay, so again, Tu is not a personal name, so Sheng is used in this particular context. So from these examples, I've kind of devised the basic translation guidelines that the Jesuits used at the beginning of the mission. So when used as an honorific for a canonized saint, Sanctus was regularly translated as xian. But when used as a marker to indicate a concept, thing, place, or person as sacred, and to distinguish it from common nouns, such as water, land, or mother, Sanctus was to be translated as sheng. But as a noun for a saint in heaven, prophet, holy man, or holy woman, it was translated as zhenren, xian shi, dao shi, or dao nu. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves at this point is, did Ruggieri and Ricci really intend to draw an equivalence between Christianity and Taoism in using this Taoist vocabulary to indicate Christian sanctity? I would say no, and for three reasons. First, when we look at the Latin source text of the Tianzhu Shulu, Sanctus is used in a very conventional way. There are no Taoist connotations in the Latin text. Second, if we look through the Chinese text of the Tianzhu Shulu, other than this Taoist vocabulary, there is no attempt to develop a Taoist Christian theology. Third, it is clear that at this early stage of the mission, the missionaries had little understanding of Taoism. They knew something of Buddhism from the Jesuits' previous experiences in Japan. And in a letter of 1584, Ricci also shows that the Jesuits had already identified Taoism as one of the three sects of China. But this reference amounts to nothing more than a name. So how should we understand this Taoist vocabulary? The Jesuits at this stage had limited Chinese, and they interpreted, depended on interpreters with local official interpreters also had little understanding of Christianity. So they resorted to a form of dynamic equivalence to render these terms into Chinese, but they had no means to reflect upon or appreciate the implications of their translation choices. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that the use of these Taoist terms would have likely caused confusion for the Chinese reader. And at one point in the Tianzhu Shulu, Ruggieri's Chinese interlocutor criticizes Amitabha and Sakyamuni as someone who has not obtained the way, or the fei de dao zhiren. And this also forms part of Ruggieri's critique of Buddhism as a demoniac sect. Now, one cannot help but wonder whether, for a Chinese reader, this barb would be interpreted as a Taoist attack on Buddhism. Yet cultural miscommunication also took place on the European side. So let's take, for example, Ruggieri and Ricci's translations of two plaques, which were gifted to them by Wang Pan, who was the Zhifu or prefect of Jiaqing for the Jesuits' first residence in China. The first read Xianhua Si, or Flower Temple of the Immortals, and this was placed on top of the main door of the Jesuits' residence. The second read Xilai Jingtu, which translates to Pure Land from the West. The Jesuits placed this above the entrance to their chapel. Now, the language of both these inscriptions is unmistakably Buddhist. Jingtu refers to land of rebirth in Pure Land Buddhism. The precise meaning of Xianhua, at least to me, is somewhat unclear. But Ronnie Xia identifies it as a reference to the lotus flower. I haven't, though, been able to find this term in any Buddhist dictionary, so I'm not exactly sure if this is 100% correct. But it's still clearly Buddhist expression here. So obviously, Wang Pan gifted these plaques to the missionaries because he presumed that they were Buddhist monks from the West, i.e. from India. For a Chinese meeting Christianity for the first time, this was a rather reasonable presupposition. Christianity and Buddhism shared so much in terms of their soteriology, liturgy, asceticism, and moral teachings. And the Jesuits themselves at this stage famously referred to themselves as Sung or Buddhist monks. They even dressed as Buddhist monks and used Buddhist vocabulary to describe various aspects of Christian doctrine. At the same time, Wang Pan was constructing a pagoda in Jiating called the Chongxita. And it seems that he wanted to add prestige to this pagoda under the belief that these monks came from India or Tianzhu. So how did Ricci and Ruggieri interpret these plaques? So let's start with Ruggieri. Ruggieri translates Silai Jingtu as Di Occidente ci vennero uomini candidissimi, which translates into English as from the West have come most resplendent men. Ruggieri seems to have confused the character tu with shi in translating tu as homo. So we can see this too if you look at the bottom here. We have the character tu with a translation of homo. Of course, this looks very similar to shi, so maybe that's where the error creeps in. Ruggieri translates Xianhua Si as Ecclesia Fior Novello degli Santi, church, which can be interpreted in two ways. It depends on whether you understand that e as being the Italian and, or e as in the Italian is. I've seen this transcribed in two different ways in the literature. So one way would be church is a new flower of the saints, or the other way would be church and new flower of the saints. But regardless of how you translate it, you can see that there are some inaccuracies in Ruggieri's rendering into Italian. In any case, in these translations, Ruggieri assumes a certain commensurability between Christian and Buddhist conceptions of sacredness. But I think that the faultiness of these translations suggests that this was probably not deliberate, because of course Ruggieri is kind of struggling to understand, these Chinese messages which have been given to him by Wang Pan. But if you want to be a little bit cynical in our interpretation, we could suggest that perhaps Ruggieri wanted to obscure the Buddhist connotations of these terms in order to make these plaques more palatable to the superior general. Because of course, the superior general of the Jesuit order would not have been so comfortable knowing that these missionaries were being referred to as Buddhist monks by the Chinese. Now let's look at Ritchie's translations. Ritchie's translations are more accurate because of course they're informed by more study of the Chinese language. In fact, one of these translations that I have here, I think it's the second one, is found in Ritchie's history of the mission, which he wrote, in 1609, so many years later. But nevertheless, Ritchie's translations also assume a certain equivalence, between Buddhist and Christian concepts of the sacred, and at the same time obscure these Buddhist connotations. So, for instance, Ritchie translates Xianhua Si as Chiesa del Fiore dei Santi, or the Church of the Flower of the Saints, and Silai Jingtu as Gente venuta dalla Santa Terra del Ponente, people having come from the Holy Land of the West. Again, here, it's not clear to the Christian reader that Holy Land here really refers to the pure land of Chinese Buddhism. Now, despite dressing as Buddhists and using this Buddhist vocabulary, etc., the missionaries' identity in China was not fixed, and over time, the Jesuits came even to be seen as Taoist sages. So, from very early on in the mission, there were rumors circulating that the Jesuits were skilled in alchemy, a discipline which in China was associated with Taoism. So one of Ritchie's early and most important collaborators in the transmission of Western scientific knowledge into China was a literatus by the name of Zhu Rukui, better known by his literary name, at least in the Christian literature, as Chu Taisu. So as Ronnie Xia recounts, Chu Taisu was most likely drawn to Ritchie because of his reputation for alchemy. And Ritchie was well aware of the Taoist associations of alchemy in China, and also of the rich corpus of alchemical texts in the Taoist canon, or the Dao Zang. You can see this from this citation that I've put here from his 1609, history of the mission. And here Ritchie relates how Taoist saints, or santi, had established the practices of outer alchemy, the Wai Dan, which aimed at the transmutation of cinnabar, or Dan, into silver, and of the inner alchemy, or Nei Dan, which aimed at the acquisition of immortality. Now, Ritchie would always deny that he had any ability in alchemy, but one can't help but wonder whether Ritchie's lexical choices encouraged this reputation. So notably, in Ritchie's early years in China, Ritchie seemed to cultivate this a persona of a Taoist sage. In fact, the earliest extant draft of his first published Chinese writing, which is the Jiao You Lin, or the Treatise on Friendship, which he signs this as a shengren, or a mountain person. Now, this term shengren, has a long history in Chinese. It's first appears in the Duozhuan, and it came to denote a Taoist sage or intellectual who has secluded himself from worldly affairs by living in the mountains. But in the Ming Dynasty, shengren indicated more of a social class of free-thinking scholars who did not hold office but sought patronage from wealthy or powerful individuals. But even though it started to become a little bit more neutral in its meaning, it still maintained Taoist insinuations, and in the past it had even been used as a title for Taoist alchemists. Now, for the heterodox Ming philosopher Li Zhi, who met Ritchie on a couple of occasions in Nanjing in 1599, shengren and shengren were to a certain degree convertible. The difference being that shengren cultivated a poetic persona, whereas shengren marketed themselves more as moral philosophers, who were versed in the classics. Now, when Li Zhi wrote a poem about his encounters with Ritchie, he compared Ritchie's eastward wanderings to the carefree meandering, or the xiao yao you in the first chapter of the Zhuangzi. Now, this association doesn't seem accidental if one considers the proem, or the introduction, of the Jiao You Lin, which Ritchie infuses with Taoist insinuations. So after describing his wanderings from the far west to Nanjing or to Jinling, Ritchie then sails to Nanpu, where he beholds the western mountain, the Xian. And in fact, upon this mountain was located a famous Taoist temple, the Wanshou. Ritchie lauds the mountain as the abode of the sages, the zhenren yuanso. This term zhenren also had deep Taoist connotations insofar as it was used in the Zhuangzi to indicate, a perfect man who does not separate from truth. And so Ritchie relates that he felt compelled to remain in this place, by the aura of the place. And so he takes up residence and is then invited by the prince, the Jian Wang, to relate his ideas on friendship. Then Ritchie withdraws, from the world to complete this commission. And so with this, Ritchie implies that the composition of the Jiao You Lin was somehow inspired by the reclusive lifestyle of the monks on the Western Mountain. Now, Ritchie eventually decided to abandon this hybrid identity of Confucian learning, a Buddhist demeanor, and Taoist vocabulary, and instead assume the identity of a Confucian literatus, and then to privilege the Confucian classics as the exclusive point of contact between Chinese thought and Christianity. And there were, of course, strategic, practical reasons for this shift. Ritchie understood that Confucianism was the ideology of the state and of the elites, and if there were even if there were strong syncretic tendencies in late Ming society, explicit identification as a Confucian intellectual could afford Ritchie with greater access to the upper echelons of power. Now, Ritchie had already started the shift in 1594. This is when Ritchie was in Shaozhou, and thus before even these first drafts of the Jiaolin were written. But it took time for this decision to filter through all the complexities of his hybrid identity and his lexical choices. And so in the standard 1601 text of the Jiaolin, Ritchie replaces shengren with xiu, a term which denotes moral cultivation, arguably has more of a Confucian flavor. Yet that highly Taoist poem that we just saw before remains in this published text. And others continue to refer to Ritchie as a shengren. So for instance, in a preface to the Jiaolin published by Zhu Tingce in 1615, Ritchie is referred to as Li Shengren. But we also know from letters written towards the end of the 16th century that Ritchie started to gain a reputation as a shengren, and this is something which the Jesuits deliberately cultivated. So in two letters to the Jesuit Superior General, Ritchie's successor as superior of the Jesuit China mission, Niccolo Longobardo, remarks that through Ritchie's intellectual activities and literary production, Ritchie had come to be known as a shengren. So in this first letter dated 10 October 1598, Longobardo cites the testimony of Ritchie's collaborator, Chu Taisu, who in turn had written a letter to Ritchie detailing how he had written a book about what Ritchie had taught him during their time together, and then related to Ritchie how Ritchie had come to be universally regarded as a shengren. And this term, Longobardo translates as the saint of this time, il santo di questo tempo. Now, what is really interesting about Longobardo's letter is that he then proceeds to explain the meaning of shengren in the Chinese context, and then boastfully introduces a comparison between Ritchie and Confucius. So I'll read my translation here. So shengren is the greatest title that we can give to a man in China because it denotes a man who was born holy and wise. So that should be santo, not. So born holy, santo, and wise, savio to the highest degree, in such a way that he can be a teacher of all, as was their Confucius. According to their books, a shengren is born every 500 years, and now they give this title to Father Matteo Ricci, as Taisu says here. Now, Ritchie himself says this as well in another letter which he sent a month earlier, but Ritchie phrases it more in general terms, rather than saying that he himself is referred to as a shengren, which would sound rather boastful and improper for a missionary. He says that the missionaries were regarded as the greatest saints that have ever been in China. Ci tengono per I maggiori santi che furono nella Cina. It's also interesting that in some Chinese language sources, we also see this mentioned. So in this history of China, the Macau, the Almen Jilie by Yin Guangren and Zhang Fulin, this is also related through like the interspersed references to Ritchie's career in China. It's interesting also because Yin and Zhang are not actually that friendly to Christianity and to the presence of foreigners in China. They're actually quite hostile. But nevertheless, they're quite sympathetic to Ritchie. They describe Ritchie as being courteous and affable, and they record that the, quote, the scholars and magistrates honored him as the sage from the far west. Now, the importance of this shift towards shengren becomes apparent in the Tianzhu Shi, or the true meaning of the Lord of Heaven, the catechism which Ritchie composed, in part to replace Ruggieri's Tianzhu Shulu. In this work, Ritchie is unambiguously critical of Taoism, Buddhism, and Neo-Confucianism. Yet he articulates a reading of ancient Confucianism as compatible with Christianity, implies that that with Christianity, he is restoring this ancient Confucianism, which had been lost over time. This new and explicit Confucian orientation required significant changes in the lexical choices for expressing the concept of Christian sanctity. So Ruggieri's Taoist vocabulary is eliminated. And now figures like St. Augustine is titled Xi Shi Shengren, thus emphasizing Augustine's intellectual and moral credentials. The usage of shengren in the Tianzhu Shi is explicitly within a Confucian intellectual and textual tradition. So let's look at two passages. So the first passage here, speaks of the authority held by the shengren for the Confucians, or the Ruzhe, and then links their sageness to the transmission of the classics. And in the second passage, the sage is a not so subtle reference to Confucius. So my view, however, is that the words you have quoted, i.e. on the need to produce offspring to fulfill the requirements of filial piety, were not handed down from the sage, but were uttered by Confucius, by Mencius. And of course, like this question of not producing offspring was quite sensitive for the Jesuits, because as priests, they were not allowed to be married and produce children. Now, the fact that Ritchie uses shengren to indicate both Augustine and Confucius raises important questions about whether Ritchie was seeking to draw an equivalence between Christian and Confucian ideals of human excellence. And we'll return to this question shortly. There are also some other words in the Tianzhu Shi which are used to indicate a Christian saint. So for instance, we have shengshen, used to indicate Saint Francis, the biblical prophets, and saints in heaven more generally. And then in another passage, we have this expression zhenren, used to indicate the saints in heaven. And in another, just as a general term for a person of moral excellence, so without any connotation of this being a Christian saint. In later editions of the Tianzhu Shi, these inconsistencies will be ironed out. And over time, shengren would appear as the default term used by the Jesuit missionaries to denote a Christian saint. And so this trend is also apparent in the revised edition of the Tianzhu Shi of the True Record of the Lord of Heaven, which was published in 1640. So all that Taoist vocabulary that we spoke about at the beginning of this talk was eliminated and replaced with shengren. So the question that we need to answer is, what are the theological implications for naming both Confucius and Augustine as shengren in the Tianzhu Shi? Is Ritchie implying that Confucius is, like Augustine, a saint in heaven? Now, the church, of course, proclaimed ex ecclesia nulla salus. There's no salvation outside of the church. But in practice, theologians had highly divergent understandings of how to understand and to define membership of the church, particularly for virtuous pagans who lived before the coming of Christ. Now, Augustine famously had a rather grim and restrictive view, but this was not universally accepted by the church. And in Ritchie's time, it was not controversial to argue that some virtuous pagans were saved. But of course, such delicate theological discussions could not take place in the Jesuits' Chinese language works, because it was not possible to proclaim definitively that Confucius was saved, and to leave open just the mere possibility that Confucius was damned would have been rather offensive for the Chinese. But Ritchie and other missionaries discussed these questions at length in their Western language works, and they let it known that the question of Confucius's salvation was asked by many of their Chinese interlocutors. So now let's have a look at how Ritchie sought to resolve these issues. So returning now again to Ritchie's history of the mission, which he wrote or compiled just before his death in 1609. Now here, Ritchie expresses a rather optimistic view that the ancient Chinese were saved due to their monotheism and their virtuous conduct. So hence, it can be hoped from the immense bounty of the Lord that many of these ancients were saved in the natural law, with that particular help that God is accustomed to grant to those who do their utmost to receive it. And in this same work, Ritchie also relates Confucius's reputation for sanctity. So I'll read the passage. The greatest philosopher among them is Confucius, who was born 551 years before the coming of the Lord to the world, and he lived a good life for more than 70 years, teaching this nation with words, deeds, and writings. Consequently, he is regarded and venerated, venerato, by all as the holiest, il più santo, man that had ever been in the world. In truth, in that which he said and his good way of living according to nature, he is not inferior to our ancient philosophers and superior to many. Now we can notice here that in this passage, Ritchie is rather cautious in his language. He doesn't quite say that Confucius was a saint, but he was regarded and venerated by the Chinese as such. So he's just conveying the Chinese point of view in this matter. But at the same time, he accepts as a fact that Confucius lived a life of extreme virtue in accordance with nature. Now, if we reconcile these two passages and follow the logic of the first passage, Ritchie is implying that Confucius fulfilled the technical requirement of salvation for a virtuous pagan. Another thing that we can notice here is the use of the verb venerare, which of course was the technical verb used in Catholic theology to indicate the honor owed by Christians to saints, as opposed to the adoration owed to God alone. Now, the use of this verb, venerare, starts to make sense when Ritchie describes the rituals offered in the Confucian temples in honor of Confucius and the correlates or the peixiang. Ritchie describes these rituals in obviously religious terms. So, the magistrates reverence Confucius twice a month. They light candles, they place incense before the altar. And on special occasions, such as Confucius's birthday, they even offer Confucius dead animals. But Ritchie is also at pains here to point out that the participants don't pray to Confucius or seek anything from him, since the benefits they receive came not from Confucius himself, but rather the application of his teachings. Now, in my view, there are some striking parallels here with Tridentine Catholic views on the veneration of saints. The Roman Catechism stresses that prayers to saints are intercessory, in the sense that we do not petition the saint. We don't pray to the saint to grant us any good, but merely ask the saint to pray on our behalf to God. The way these rituals are depicted, to our mind, look very similar to sacrifices. And in another passage that was deleted in the official version of the text that was published in 1615, Latin translation by Nicholas Trigot, Ricci even uses the word sacrificio to describe them. Now, of course, in Catholic theology, we do not offer sacrifices to saints because sacrifices are due to God alone, and a sacrifice implies the divinity in its object. But Ricci's attempt to correct this slip reveals that he still had the Catholic theology of saints in mind, because he adds and stresses that the Chinese do not recognize in Confucius any divinity or ask anything from him. And then you can see he adds in a marginal annotation, and thus it cannot be called a true sacrifice. So these are improper sacrifices. In the 1630s, Dominican and Franciscan missionaries arrived in China. They witnessed ancestral rituals in Muyang in Fujian province, and then formed the view that the rituals offered in honor of Confucius and ancestors were in fact sacrifices and thus not permissible for Chinese Catholic converts. And so this was the beginning of the notorious Chinese rites controversy. Now, the leading opponents of the Chinese rites were the Dominican friar Juan Bautista Morales and the Franciscan friar Antonio de Santa Maria Caballero. Now, how did the Jesuits respond to this initial attack in the 1630s? Well, they responded by doubling down on Ricci's thesis. And we can see that in this initial response, the Catholic theology of saints continued to play an important role in how the Jesuits defended the legitimacy of the Confucian rituals. So one of the earliest responses of the friars was that of Francisco Furtado, who was the Jesuit vice provincial in the late 1630s. So on 8 February 1640, Furtado responds to 12 questions raised by Morales. And here he repeats Ricci's view that the honors paid to Confucius were appropriate because of Confucius's reputed virtues and teaching. And following Ricci claims that even though the rituals in honor of Confucius were called sacrifice in Chinese, or qi, these rituals weren't really sacrifices, but, quote, an improper sacrifice. And so to explain this, he draws a parallel with Christian saints. Christians would often speak of offering sacrifices to saints to obtain some benefit, but we know that the sacrifices are offered to God alone. So it's like a metaphoric way of speaking rather than a theologically correct way of speaking. And he sees this as applicable in the Chinese context as well. It's also interesting that in Furtado's response to Morales, Furtado also discusses the question of Confucius's salvation. And to answer this question, he employs both a Chinese and Christian perspective. And so from a Chinese perspective, he argues that Confucianism did indeed have a concept of the afterlife, but this concept was indicated only implicitly or sub oscure. According to Furtado, the Chinese classics indicate that good actions are rewarded and bad actions are punished after death in places like heaven and hell, even if such precise vocabulary wasn't used. And so as examples of souls in heaven, he cites the sage kings Yao and Xin, as well as Confucius. And for souls in hell, he mentions Jie of the Xia dynasty and Zhou of the Shang dynasty, who in Chinese historiography were synonymous with tyranny. But there was no purgatory, according to Furtado, in the Chinese tradition. So if you were neither exceptionally good nor exceptionally bad, your soul was dissipated after death in the air like smoke. Now, from a Christian perspective, Furtado considers both theological and political concerns. So on a theological level, he knows that he cannot proclaim definitively that Confucius was saved, but he's also aware that to insinuate the possibility that Confucius is damned would offend the Chinese and then therefore endanger the mission. And so Furtado says that this question is best answered with a syllogism. All those who know God and love him above all things and depart from this life with this knowledge and love are saved. If Confucius knew God and loved him above all things and passed away with this knowledge and love, then he is undoubtedly saved. Now, Furtado leaves it open to the Chinese literati to determine whether Confucius fulfilled these conditions by investigating their own books. And naturally, given that the Jesuits believed that Confucius was monotheist and accepted uncritically Confucius's reputation for virtue, Furtado was indeed leading his interlocutors to the conclusion that Confucius was saved without definitively proclaiming such. Morales was unconvinced by Furtado's response and then proceeded to Rome to present 17 queries about the Jesuits' missionary practice in China, especially their toleration of Confucian and ancestral rituals. There are also other questions which we won't go through today. Today, we'll just focus on question 14, which concerns the use of the word sheng. Morales took issue with the fact that the Jesuits use this character in their Chinese writings, both for Christian entities such as the Trinity, Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, as well as for Confucius and the sage kings. Morales acknowledges that Confucius and the sage kings had a reputation for sanctity in China, but he asserts that Confucius and the sage kings were pagan idolaters. Morales was evidently concerned that the use of the same character as a title for Confucius and a saint in the same word would imply a false equivalence between them. So how did Propaganda Fide reply to Morales? So overall, Morales was quite successful. This, the result of this was, of course, the 1645 decree of Propaganda Fide, which accepted almost all of Morales's claims about the superstitions and idolatries of the Confucian ancestral rituals. And as a consequence, Propaganda Fide prohibited Catholics from participating in them. And this was, of course, a massive blow to the Jesuits, their missionary strategy, and also their reputation. What's really interesting, though, is that Propaganda Fide's response on question 14, on this usage of the word sheng, was non-committal. Propaganda professed that they did not have the linguistic expertise to determine the true meaning of sheng, and responded with a surprising degree of flexibility. So I'll read the quote here. If this word in the Kingdom of China has a wide range or wide semantic range, ministers can use it. However, if it is restricted to mean true and perfect sanctity, then it cannot be used. This response is quite remarkable because on the face of Morales's evidence to Propaganda Fide, Confucius and the sage kings were idolaters. But Propaganda doesn't seem worried by this. They accept that words can have different meanings in different contexts. Hence, they don't believe that using the same word for both Confucius and Augustine necessarily implied a false equivalence. Hence, for Propaganda Fide, further theological research was necessary to resolve this issue. The Jesuits understandably resisted the 1645 decree, and they dispatched Martino Martini as procurator to argue against its provisions. And then the Holy Office, in a decree of 1656, accepted Martini's explanation of the rights as civil and political that were devoid of religious significance. But the ambiguity of the 1645 decree relating to the usage of sheng benefited the Jesuits. So in Martini's submissions to the Holy Office, Martini didn't mention it at all. And at the same time, we've seen several Jesuit biographies of Confucius published, from the 1660s onwards, such as the Sapientia Sinica, and also the Scientia Politica Moralis and the Confucius Sinarum Philosophos, most importantly of all, in 1687. And in each of these works, Confucius' life was narrated in hagiographic terms, and Confucius even came to be described as a prophet who foretold the coming of Christ. And the key evidence for this was Confucius' proclamation in the Liezi, the Xifang you shengren, there is a saint in the West. What I find interesting and perhaps not sufficiently noted in scholarship on the mission is that it wasn't just the Jesuits who took advantage of this flexibility in the 14th article of the 1645 decree. We mentioned before that Caballero, was one of the most fervent opponents of the Chinese rites, but he embraced the leeway of this article to develop a more positive perspective on Confucius compared to Morales. So we can see this in the submissions that Caballero made to express his opposition to the 1656 decree. So on 20 August 1661, Caballero signed a sworn declaration or a declaratio sub juramento, in which he details point by point the problems with Martini's evidence. Yet in this document, Caballero seems to accept that sheng has a broad meaning, and he even paraphrases Propaganda Fide's response, even though Propaganda Fide only phrases it in conditional terms. So the word and character sheng has a broad meaning, for it means either true sanctity or the excellence of someone before others. So there's flexibility in what this term might mean in the Chinese context. According to the logic of the 1645 decree, Caballero implies that he did not oppose its usage with both Chinese sages and Christian saints in the same publication. Caballero also explicitly agrees with Ritchie's view that Confucius was monotheist and of exemplary virtue, and thus contradicts Morales's testimony that Confucius was an idolater. Now, these insights are then built upon in another report that Caballero wrote called The Relation on the Sects of China, the Relatio Sinae Sectarum, which he finished on 18 November 1662. Here, Caballero remarkably asserts that Confucius was saved as a virtuous pagan. So after having completed 73 years of his life, he died 659 years before St. Thomas the Apostle preached the gospel to China. Concerning similar pagan men who did not have a higher life than that of the law of nature, but if they were to have had it, they would have followed it and did as much as they could do by themselves and lived according to the rectitude of natural reason, Christ the Lord revealed to St. Bridget in her revelations that they will not be judged with the wicked, i.e. that saved in heaven. Now, remember that not even Ricci or Furtado were brazen enough to state so explicitly that Confucius was saved. They merely led the reader into that direction, through Furtado's syllogism, or through the insinuation that Confucius was a moral exemplar in how he pursued the natural law. So in a way, Caballero is actually going beyond the Jesuit position in stating so explicitly that Confucius was saved. This is really important because we can see here that the Chinese rites controversy, wasn't just a partisan dispute, between mendicant friars and the Jesuits, but there actually were differences of opinions even within the rival camps. Now let's contrast Caballero's response to Morales' response. And as we said before, Morales was more extreme in his opposition to Confucianism compared to Caballero. Now, Morales also submitted petitions to Rome to overturn the 1656 decree. But as I argue, for Morales, this was not enough. He also wanted to remove the one concession that Propaganda Fide gave the Jesuits, the flexibility over the usage of sheng. So on 30 May 1661, Morales and his Dominican confreres signed a document titled the Relatio et Libello Supplex, a report and petition. The report is basically authored by Morales. And like Caballero's petition, this document was written with the intention of demonstrating the factual errors in Martini's description of the Chinese rites. But one point of the text, Morales discusses the significance of the title sheng attributed to Confucius. And to support his analysis, he consults the influential Chinese dictionary, the Zihui, which had been published by Mei Yingzuo in 1615. This dictionary was also consulted by other missionaries at the time because it was perhaps like the most authoritative text on the Chinese lexicon at the time. So now let's have a look at how he translates the entry on sheng. So I put the original Chinese on the right for you to follow as well. I didn't attempt to transcribe it. Hopefully it's clear enough. So Morales writes, sheng, that is fully and perfectly all good, either the virtues or gifts of the intellect which are found in man, culmination or summit in those virtues above which a person cannot pass, or the supreme height of all virtues to which a person can reach. I apologize, my translation is very literal. So it's not very elegant English. And cannot go further. And because in all things nothing can be found which it does not penetrate, and it knows even future things. Now, I argue that the way in which Morales has translated this dictionary definition seems squarely aimed at answering Propaganda Fide's question about the semantic range of the term sheng. So far from possessing a broad range of meaning, this definition shows that sheng was highly restrictive in meaning, in the sense that it indicates moral and intellectual perfection to an extreme degree and even suggests prophetic ability. And Morales then elaborates that this honor is bestowed on Confucius because his teaching is considered infallible, like sacred scripture in Christian Europe. Now, Morales and Caballero were not successful in their petitions, and the status quo in Europe persisted up to 1693, when Charles Maigret, who was the apostolic vicar of the mission in Fujian province, issued an edict or a mandatum prohibiting the practice of the Chinese rites in Fujian. Maigret doesn't mention the question of sheng in the mandatum, but this question does emerge in the debates over the translation. So in the debates over the mandatum in subsequent years in Rome. So in 1697, 4 theologians in Rome examined Maigret's edicts with the assistance of the Vicar Apostolic of Hunan and Guangdong, Giovanni Francesco Nicolai Leonessa. So obviously these theologians in Rome didn't have the faintest idea of the Chinese language or culture, and so they relied upon Nicolai to draw up a report and to explain the meaning of terms and concepts. And then, based upon the advice that Nicolai gave them, they issued a decision. Now, for Nicolai, the controversy over the Confucian rites can only be resolved with a satisfactory understanding of sheng. Does sheng denote merely an individual of great moral or intellectual worth, or does it necessarily have religious overtones? Thus, the question is, should sheng be translated as sanctus or sapiens? A work that Nicolai consulted to answer this question was the Daming Huidian. This is, the collection of official statutes of the Ming Dynasty that was finished in 1597. And again, this work appears a lot in the in missionary writings and discussions of the Chinese rites. According to Nicolai, in this work, Confucius is portrayed not merely as an ordinary sheng, but as a sheng par excellence. Confucius's virtue is compared to heaven and earth, and his spirit has surpassed all other sheng of the past. He also points to the Chinese classics, which narrate how sheng ascend into heaven after death, and from heaven grant favors to people, and have been venerated from antiquity to the present as saints. And so Nicolai, on this basis, argues that sanctitas is inextricable from sheng, even if this term has connotations of sapientia. And so the ultimate result of all these discussions, as most of us know, was the 1704 papal decree, the Cum Deus Optimus, which definitively condemned the Chinese rites and thus irrevocably changing the face of the Chinese mission. So, in my talk today, I've sought to show how far-reaching and complex were the questions surrounding the translation of the Christian concept of holiness into Chinese. The lexical choices that the missionaries used for expressing Sanctus not only had implications for how Christianity as a religion was understood, but also for the missionaries' own identities in their interactions with the Chinese and how they were perceived by the Chinese. So just as Ruggieri employed Taoist vocabulary to convey Christian sanctity in the Tianru Shulu and Buddhist vocabulary elsewhere, so emerged a hybrid identity of the missionaries as Buddhist monks and Taoist alchemists, which Ricci would later more explicitly embrace in marketing himself as a Taoist sage or shengren. Yet, we should be wary of attributing to the Jesuits disproportionate agency in this translational process and this process of representation in the Chinese context. So especially in the 1580s, when Ruggieri and Ricci were first learning the ropes, they lacked the linguistic and cultural knowledge to understand the significance of their translations. And they relied on native Chinese as their interpreters, who employed dynamic equivalences to make sense of this new religion. And thus it could therefore be argued that the experimentalism seen in this early missionary period was not, properly speaking, an accommodation, insofar as accommodation denotes a conscious decision on the part of a subject expert to adapt to the needs of a target audience. Rather, it bears more the marks of an indigenous Chinese reading of Christianity and a spontaneous response to the presence of these mysterious missionary figures. Naturally, over time, as the missionaries became better versed in the Chinese language and culture, they had greater ownership over their lexical choices, but their Chinese collaborators still played a key role in prompting and guiding the missionaries in the decision-making process. Given the eclectic or even syncretic frame in which Christianity was first received and interpreted by the Chinese, does it make sense to privilege Confucianism in our comparative studies of Chinese and Christian thought? Reflecting on these spontaneous and indigenous Chinese readings of Christianity may help us develop a richer comparative analysis of Chinese and Christian conceptions of human excellence and reflect better on how Christianity can integrate within an Asian context. This experimental stage yielded to a more rigid and systematic Confucian orientation, which then in turn was deconstructed with European theological categories during the Chinese rites controversy. During this debate, the agency of the missionaries' Chinese collaborators was diminished, as the questions were decided primarily in Europe by theologians with minimal understanding of Chinese culture and language. And yet, as we see with the question of Sheng, the theologians professed their linguistic ignorance, inviting the missionaries to reflect further on the polyvalence of words and to avoid assuming simplistic equivalences. As we see in the studies of Huang and Tran, the interpretive frames developed by the rival camps in the Chinese rites controversy still inform debates over Confucianism, and Chinese religion today. So even though the Chinese rites controversy concluded with a condemnation of enculturation and a more restrictive understanding of the Catholic Church's relationship with non-Christian, the debates that unfolded during the Chinese rites controversy also prompted missionaries to confront unresolved questions about how non-Christian forms of human excellence should be valorized and described within the church. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
So thank you so much, Dr. Daniel, for this very clear and very elaborate presentation of the difficulty of translating these terms, and also the particular context in China and Europe, influencing the interpretation of these things. But I'm not really an expert on this, so we leave the response to a really expert and someone who has been already collaborating with you, Professor Thierry Ménard. Perhaps very shortly, I will introduce him, not to take too much time. Thierry Ménard is professor at the Philosophy Department of Sun Yat-sen University, Guangzhou, where he teaches Western philosophy and Latin classics. He is vice director of the Archive for the Introduction of Western Knowledge at Sun Yat-sen University. Formerly, he was also the director of the Beijing Center for Chinese Studies, a study program established by the Jesuits in 1998. So I'm not going to go in these many publications. Father Thierry Ménard has been really very productive in Chinese as well as in English. So the floor is yours, Professor Thierry Ménard.
Thank you very much, Father Patrick, for this nice introduction. So here is my response. You can see it on the screen. Since the beginning of his proclamation, the gospel is not restricted to a group of people, but addressed to all, the Jews and the Greek, the slave and the free man and women, as St. Paul said. The unity of all humanity in Christ shall be realized only at the end of history. And while the existence of non-Christian in human history has often been read as a sign of human pride, resisting to divine grace, the very existence of non-Christian could be also understood as a useful reminder of the imperfection and the defects of the church, which are keeping away people from embracing Christianity. It took 3 centuries for the church to Christianize the Roman Empire, although the conversion of Eastern Europe was completed only in the 12th century. Yet, Northern Africa and the Middle East shifted mostly from Christianity toward Islam. It is only in the 16th century that Westerners encountered China. And unlike the people in the Americas, Africa, and India, that appear to them as inferior in many respects, Westerners were positively impressed by the Chinese civilization with its long history, its classics, and its political order. Dr. Canary's paper scrutinizes a real concern among the first missionaries in China, which may threaten the universal claim of Christianity. If the Chinese people had indeed reached human excellence, could this mean that God had benefited the Chinese people outside the mediation of the church? Did the Chinese people reach human excellence without the help of divine grace? Or instead, is it necessary to lower down the Chinese human excellence to manifest more clearly the superiority of the Christian faith? The paper by Dr. Canaris offers a very refined linguistic analysis of the translation of the Christian term Sanctus into the Chinese language. The absolute transcendence of Yahweh in the Bible seems to request that the divine name should not be translated in any common name, such as Theos, Deus, God, Shun, or Shandi. And yet, the Church has used those common names in Greek, Latin, English, and Chinese in reference to the divine. Similarly, the term Sanctus describes a specific relation between a human being and Jesus Christ, which should not be translated as such. The difficulty is that the term Sanctus predates Christianity, and it was borrowed from the pagan culture. In the first part of the paper, Dr. Canaris deals with the question of the identity of the first missionaries in China. And it shows that the question is more complex than it is usually explained. Besides the Buddhist element, which compose the identity of Ruggieri and Ricci to the eyes of the Chinese, Dr. Canaris shows with great accuracy the Taoist elements with the use of the Taoist terms like a xian, a zhenren, to express the Christian context of Sanctus. His analyses show the experimental nature of translating Christian terminology in the first 2 decades of the China mission. Even though the Jesuits quickly identified the problematic syncretism of the free teaching, they lack a deeper knowledge of the free teaching, and they were borrowing terms from the free, paradoxically reinforcing the syncretism which they attempted to denounce. Ricci dispelled the confusion of the initial period by fixing the Christian terminology in the Chinese language with the exclusive use of Confucianism, so that he adopted shengren as the equivalent for Sanctus. What seems to me more problematic is the willingness of the missionaries to endorse the name of shengren for themselves, as testified by Longobardo's letter of 1598 and 1599 in reference to Ricci, and by Ricci's own letter of 1599. If indeed the missionaries promoted the Christian idea of Sanctus, shengren, it is unbelievable that they would assume this identity for themselves, especially since Ricci was still alive at that time. To claim to have attained human excellence is a clear proof that the claim itself is ill-founded. And in the Christian tradition, it reveals human pride. Even the disciples of Confucius say that their teacher was shengren, but Confucius himself denied being so in Long Yu, chapter 7. Longobardo's claim that Ricci was regarded as a shengren born every 500 years seems to be difficult to understand, even though some Chinese later may have claimed that Aleni was even greater than Confucius. On one hand, we have the idea that Confucius is a shengren per excellence, but on the other hand, we have also the idea of Wang Yangming that the streets are filled with shengren. In this second meaning, the claim made by Ricci and Longobardo to be perceived as a shengren is more easily understood, as it is attested by the record of the Ormen Jilue. It seems that Ricci and Longobardo misunderstood the different levels of being a shengren in the Confucian tradition. And while the Chinese may have called them as shengren in an extended and broad meaning, like in Wyoming, our two missionaries understood shengren with its highest meaning, every 500 years for Longobardo, or the greatest saint ever for Ricci. Behind was a boastful affirmation. Ricci and Longobardo intended mostly to show to people in Europe that their mission was getting some success, and they would need even more support from Europe for this promising enterprise. But since the missionaries were promoting in China the Christian idea of Sanctus, shengren, assuming the same term for themselves was quite problematic. As Dr. Canaris explained, Ricci applies the term shengren both to Confucius and Augustine. And this suggests to the Chinese reader an equivalence between the Christian and Confucian ideals of human excellence. The theological implications are analyzed in the second part of the paper. While a pessimistic anthropology had traditionally emphasized that human reason and virtue had been radically damaged at the fall, according to St. Augustine, and that human excellence cannot be attained without God's grace and the sacraments of the church, Ricci, on the contrary, embraced a more generous Christian anthropology, which allowed for the salvation of non-Christian, like Confucius. The statement by Caballero Santa Maria in 1662 that Confucius was saved is quite remarkable. But Caballero was already shifting away from this generous position, since the year before, in 1661, he had just translated the Treaty of Longobardo, treatise which show the materialistic and atheistic roots of all Confucianism. And at the end of his life in Guangzhou, Longobardo was mostly aligned to Navarrete in raising doubts about the fact of Confucius, even though their focus was mostly against the right to Confucius. Since the beginning of the China mission, the debate was dominated by the idea that Confucius and the other shengren needed to be reduced to a kind of commensurability. But this idea has largely prevented Christianity of recognizing how it could learn and be enriched from another tradition. There may be a healthy stimulation among different traditions towards human excellence, pushing each tradition to rise to a higher standard. As the sexual abuses in the Catholic Church have made us acutely aware, we often fail as individual and institution to be up to the standard of human excellence that we are holding. As a Christian, we believe that human excellence is truly found in the humility and the kenosis of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kirmenar, for your usual very perceptive and incisive remarks. So let us now open the floor to our participants, and please, when you speak and unmute your microphone, let us know who you are, and please address your question to either Dr. Daniel or the respondent, Father Kirmenar. So I leave now open the floor to the participants. Is there any remark, or perhaps Dr. Daniel, do you have any comments on the response by Father Thierry Menard? That would also be very interesting to know.
Yes,
Dr. Daniel.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Father Thierry, for this very thoughtful and reflective response that, also, I think, it contextualizes, some of these issues of, cultural dialogue, also in terms of, fundamental questions of the, the church's legitimacy, given, some of the moral scandals that have, afflicted the church in recent years. I think, some of the points that you raised here are actually really interesting, and I think also gives me some, important food for thought, of how I'm going to develop the paper, before it. And what Longobardo said in relation to Richie being called a shengren is really quite insightful, because it shows misinterpreting the information that they received from the Chinese. In fact, it's possible the missionaries were, Longobardo was thinking about the meaning of shengren more in terms of the context of the classical texts, and perhaps he wasn't so well versed in the thought of Wang Yangming. And I think it's quite clear that in the late Ming context, to be called a shengren doesn't necessarily imply that you were of an equivalent status to Confucius. Anything else that I have to respond? No, thank you so much for that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Daniel, for your response. Again, a question to our participants. Anybody who has a question to either Dr. Daniel or Professor Thierry Menard?
There is a questions in the chat room.
All right.
Yes. So Thomas Kin asked about the Catholic Church's current position. So my understanding about the Catholic Church's current position is that there's been a relaxation, at least since the 1930s, and so it's not considered to be against the teachings of the Catholic Church for Chinese Catholics, to engage in these ancestral and Confucian rituals. And in part, this relaxation was because of the Catholic Church's attempt to maintain friendly relations with the Japanese government before the Second World War, and also with the Manchukuo government, because in Manchukuo the Japanese government was trying to restore or to legitimize the government on the basis of Confucianism. But I'm not exactly sure in like present day Chinese Catholicism how widely practiced these ancestral rituals are. And perhaps Professor Menard might be able to add more on that. I think some of these debates are a little bit defunct, also in particular because of the Second Vatican Council, which has completely changed the Catholic Church's understanding of itself and its relationship with other religions. Do you have anything to add to that, Professor Menard?
Yes, I mean, I should say only that in Taiwan, there has been a lot of effort, I mean, in the 60s, 70s to develop, I mean, inside the Catholic Church, the ritual to the ancestor. And so in many churches in Taiwan, you can still see also the names of the, at the back of the church, you see the names of the ancestor, or things like that. So I don't know the situation in Hong Kong, but in mainland China, probably it is not as noticed as in Taiwan. So I should say, but there is the possibility in the ritual in mainland China to offer masses for the ancestor, and for especially for the Chinese New Year and the first year of the Chinese New Year, there is a ritual. But perhaps people in Hong Kong, they will know more about it.
Yes, as in Hong Kong, yeah, when I was young, even it is allowed, especially in the Chinese New Year, we did some ancestral ritual in the church, and we show our respect or to venerate our ancestors, and it's a good tradition which is not against our Christian doctrines. Yeah, I have a question when we always, like a Pope or even in Vatican II, we emphasize the dialogue, interreligious dialogue and dialogue with other cultures. And we find it's not easy, in your talk, Dr. Daniel, it seems that we have different understanding of the human excellence, between the Chinese and Christians or Christianities. And I just think, how do you think, Dr. Daniel and Professor Maynard think that this dialogue or these difficulties in the dialogue between different cultures have an impact on what we call inculturation, in China, or, this term is Sinicization of Christianity, and any comments or your thoughts on this way? Yeah. And how can we have a good dialogue, between this, China and Christianity?
Yeah, so I think, especially what Father Maynard said at the end of his talk about approaching dialogue, not with the presumption that you have, all the answers. Like, we need to approach others with a sense of humility and also understanding of, your own failures and your own limitations of your own, of your own religion, of your own, philosophical and moral beliefs. And so I think, I guess one of the problems, with the Catholic Church is that the Catholic Church, makes rather exclusivist claims about its identity as, being the religion of salvation, etc. It makes it very hard, for the Catholic Church to listen to other faiths. In fact, the very act of listening to many in the church implies that there's some sort of failing in the church, or this imperfection in the church. And I think it's just a matter of humility, that we need to get over this mentality and see that other religions and other philosophical worldviews have a lot to offer, and that does not necessarily imply that they're better than us in any way. I think it's just dialoguing with people on a level playing field. Do you have anything to add to that, Father?
Yes, I agree with you that I mean, the theology of religion is very important to understand from the point of view of our Christian theology, how we can have a positive understanding of other religion, and how other religion by their own existence also can help us to be more Christian in a way. So I think it is very important that to do that. So in China, the problem, of course, is that the religion are, I mean, the 5 official religions are very much under the umbrella of the government, and so somehow it is not so easy to have a kind of dialogue. I mean, what will go freely between the religion, because there is this structure which is necessary in somehow, but does not really help to this kind of dialogue, I believe. So yes, so probably I think in Hong Kong or Taiwan, probably it is perhaps easier perhaps to develop today this kind of religious dialogue, I think.
Yeah, there is observations or comments in the chat box from a participant, Nka Chai. Yeah, he's a PhD student in our department of religious studies, and yeah, I just read them out. Yeah, the first observation. Mr. Ng believes that one reason that Ruggieri catechisms use xian may be the emphasis of heaven in Christian eschatology. His Chinese assistant might think the ascension is similar to Taoist. And the second observation, as you may be aware, in Po Xie that anti-Christian Chinese literati Hua Zhang and Xu Da Shou both mentioned that they heard from Aleni that the Chinese ancient sages and ancestors were somewhere in Lianqing Diyu. Probably Aleni was referring to the limbo of patriarchs. This also supports your discussion of the salvation of Confucian, as those in the limbo of patriarchs were supposed to be saved when Christ descended into hell, which Tridentine Catechism refers to the limbo of patriarch. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think those are really interesting insights, and I think in particular what Ka-Chai Nung says in relation to xian is quite accurate, because I mean, because especially as we understand shengren today, or sheng in the Confucian context, so it's seen more as a secular term without implications necessarily of the afterlife. And so perhaps for Ruggieri's Chinese interlocutors, it just made better sense to use a Taoist vocabulary, in particular because the Taoist vocabulary had implications about immortality, about the forever after, in the afterlife. And I think this also adds to my point that in these comparative discussions of Chinese and Christian thought, we have to kind of expand our paradigm, to embrace other aspects of the Chinese of Chinese tradition. Now, in relation to Xu Da Shou, yes, I think that is. Let me just read it again. Sorry. Yeah, yeah. So you think the Lianqing refers to the limbo of the patriarchs? Is that so? Would you think that's an accurate reading, Father Thierry?
Yeah, probably is a purgatory. I mean, the lian is a purgatory.
Yeah. Because the limbo of the patriarchs and purgatory are different theological concepts, aren't they? Because the limbo of the patriarchs was the place where the patriarchs entered after death, before the coming of Christ. Yeah. So.
But the purgatory is different, right?
Yeah, purgatory is different. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, purgatory is a theological concept which was developed much later, I think, in the church's history. In fact, it doesn't really have I guess no references to purgatory in scripture, and also even in early Christian texts, but it was conceived, I guess, to understand how various people dying in the state of grace can all go to heaven, even though they're at very different levels of sanctity.
Yeah, according to the Vatican II teachings, documents, is the salvation of Confucius solved?
No, I don't think so. I mean, absolutely not. I think it's impossible for the church to to formally state the salvation of anyone outside of the the ordinary processes of canonization. But of course, with canonization, you cannot canonize people who are not baptized. And so I think this sort of question cannot be resolved definitively. But I guess the church also now has a very different emphasis, in its understanding of salvation outside of the ordinary church. We think we have a generous understanding, for instance, of this idea of like baptism of desire. This notion that that if someone dies with this implicit desire of being baptized in the church, should they be afforded the opportunity, then God in His mercy would afford that, would afford salvation to that person. So I think perhaps in the modern church, it's not so much of a problem because we don't really think about it so much. But you could also argue that the generosity of spirit that we have today in the church is very much a product of these discussions which were taking place in the 17th century, because it wasn't really such a hot topic, I would say, in the 17th century, like the salvation of virtuous pagans, because everyone in Europe was basically Christian. So it wasn't really a question of whether virtuous pagans were being saved, it's whether Protestants were saved or not. That was the big question.
Thank you, Dan. There's another question in the chat box, from Cynthia Pun. Her question is, it seems the early missionaries have fewer difficulties with the translation of wise compared with saint, holy. If so, why? Considering both holy and wise are titles of God. Any comment on this one? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that question. I think well, the difference is, of course, is that the word saint has certain implications about a person's state after death. That person's in heaven, whereas you could be wise but damned. I mean, so wise was not really a theological problem in the same way that sanctity was a theological problem.
Yeah. Wise, yeah. Okay. Kachai has a follow-up. He said in the Catechism in Chinese of the 17th century, written by missionaries, they taught 4 levels of hell together: limbo of infants, limbo of patriarchs, purgatory, and hell. Huang Zheng and Xu Dashou both mentioned Lianqing Diyu. They might have heard about these, but mixed. In particular, Xu Dashou, as said the sages and kings in Lianqing Diyu were not painful. So Kachai, clarify or make us understand that there are 4 levels, even for the missionaries, 4 levels of hell.
Yeah, well, I mean, if that's the case, if Xu Dashou really does describe the Lianqing Diyu as not being painful, then that would definitely sound more like the either limbo of the infants or limbo of the patriarchs as opposed to purgatory, because of course, we know that in purgatory we are sanctified by hellfire, right? So that does make sense. So to be honest, I have not read these texts that Kachai is referring to, so I can't comment, but that's a really interesting observation. But of course, I mean, this notion of the 4 levels of hell was also a standard part of Catholic theology at the time. I mean, the limbo of infants and even the limbo of patriarchs had a somewhat problematic theological status. In particular, limbo of infants, I don't think was ever formally defined by the church, and in fact, I think the church today tends to reject the limbo of infants. It was Pope Benedict XVI, if I'm not mistaken, who stated that the limbo of infants doesn't exist. I think it was Benedict XVI, yeah. So, but in any case, but this just reflected the standard 17th century understanding.
I think the problem is problem of translation. Again, translating purgatory as lien yu, is still a U. U is a prison. is a prison, and to put Confucius in the Lian Qing DU, even though it is not painful, but still is it a DU? So it's still not acceptable for Chinese culture. Still,
yeah. Confucius has to be in heaven, not something in the day state. He's still waiting for salvation or something. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Canaris and Professor Maynard. And Father Patrick, are you here with us?
Yes, I can hear you, but I cannot see you. Can you hear me?
Neither do I.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine, because I've been following the whole discussion, and I found it very interesting. And again, thank you so much to Dr. Daniel Canaris and Father Professor Thierry Menard for this very enjoyable and very perceptive and incisive discussion. And I think we had this afternoon a wonderful preparation for our upcoming symposium on Matteo Ricci. I think the whole background here, linguistically and also contextually, will help us to even go more deeper in this wonderful encounter through Matteo Ricci between the East and the West. So thank you all so much here from Ulaanbaatar.
Yeah, thank you, Father Patrick, for your kind support, to this lecture. And as you mentioned, an upcoming conference or symposium on Matteo Ricci will be held in May 11th and 12th, 2 days, which will be conducted in Mandarin, and scholars on Matteo Ricci from mainland Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau will come join us together. It is an online symposium, so stay tuned. More information about the symposium is coming. Thank you very much. Thank you once again for all the participants and attendees, and especially our speaker and respondent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.